have you all here today. Our second speaker for this morning will be Dr. Sarah Myers with her presentation on I Was Happiest in the Sky, the Women Airforce Service Pilots of 1942 to 1944. When the United States Army Air Force utilized women pilots to fly military aircraft for the first time during World War II, women joined for similar motivations as male pilots, a deep love of flying and patriotism. The Women's Air Force Service Pilots received the same training as men minus combat and served in assignments at bases across the continental United States. They were the only women's military unit during the war that did not receive a military status from Congress. Excuse me. So that the 38 female pilots who lost their lives in service to their country did not receive the recognition or benefits that they should have. Earning their wings, the WASP of World War II and their fight for veteran recognition tells the story of these female pilots from that era, of Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh through the 1970s when the WASPs finally earned their veteran status. Dr. Sarah Myers is an associate professor of history at Messiah University. She shared her histories of World War II and veterans with C-SPAN, PBS, the United States National Archives, and the National Army Museum. She was awarded a National Endowment of the Humanities Dialogus on the Experiences of War grant for a program focused on generating dialogue with female veterans. She led discussion workshops for this grant at the Military Women's Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. Prior to her position at Messiah College, she was the director of a World War II museum in St. Francis University, where she curated museum exhibits and an oral history project from Pennsylvania veterans, including the United States Army Rangers at D-Day. So let's give a big round of applause to Dr. Myers.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the park rangers who organize these events this morning. There's a lot that goes to the background, and thank you all for taking the time to come today, because I know that you have a lot of other options, and so I appreciate you taking the time to come and hear this history and to honor these women's legacy by learning more about their history. So with that, I would like to give you a quote from Cornelia Fort, one of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, which is what the title of my talk is based around today. So Cornelia Fort, who is one of these WASP, said, "I was happiest in the sky, at dawn when the quietness of the air was like a caress, when the noon sun beat down, and at dusk when the sky was drenched with the fading lights." I use her quote because it speaks to the beauty of flights that all pilots during World War II respected and thought about, the ways that they just loved the experience of aviation, but also especially loved the experience of military aviation, which was different from smaller civilian aircraft. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience of that. Cornelia Fort is also a really interesting individual. She was in the same social circles as Amelia Earhart, who is the infamous female pilot of these pre-World War II generation. She also was a wealthy woman who was from Nashville, Tennessee, and she earned her pilot's license and was the first female flight instructor in the state of Tennessee. So she has that interesting distinction. She also was at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, which I don't need to explain to this crowd. What was happening was she was actually a civilian instructor at the time. She had a male pilot who was her student, who's in the plane with her, and she said as they were flying, all of a sudden she realizes what becomes the attack when she sees a Japanese aircraft fly above her, and she knows immediately this is an emergency situation and we need to land. Both she and the pilot successfully landed at Pearl Harbor, and then when the women's pilot program started in 1942, she was literally in the first 28 women to sign up for this program. Cornelia Fort also tragically lost her life during World War II. In March of 1943, she was involved in an accident that was the fault of one of the male pilots who was flying in formation with her. There were accident reports that were taken during World War II, just like there are today, and this was the fault of that male pilot, but it was not intentional. And so Cornelia Fort, when she loses her life in 1943, her family family, because of her status as a civilian, because women were not considered veteran pilots until the 1970s. So because she was civilian, that meant that her family was not allowed to display a gold star. They were not allowed to have a military funeral. In fact, they raised funds to ship her body home, and there was the director of the WASP program, Jackie Cochran, who actually has to WASP accompany her body home, as is typical practice, but Jackie Cochran did that out of her own money and bank account. And so Cornelia Fort represents this position of women, like their interest in flight and also their position in this time period in history, but she also represents the fact that these women are then, not having the same status as other military servicemen and women during World War II. The Women Airforce Service Pilots are actually the only women's service unit during the war that does not receive military status, and so we'll also talk more about that. So when the war starts in Europe in 1939, both these women pilots, Jackie Cochran and Nancy Love, approach the Army Air Force and General Arnold specifically, because they both have connections to him, and say that they're interested in women helping with the war effort as pilots. They say, we know we're not in a war at the moment, but just keep us in mind. We think that women pilots would be useful for the war effort should we get involved. They also are very well aware that in 1939, there is a civilian pilot training program. It was called CPTP. And this civilian pilot training program was started by President Roosevelt. It was actually one of his New Deal government legislation programs. And what it did was it trained pilots for free, so that with the war starting in Europe, Roosevelt and others realized what is to come, and we need to build up our reserves of numbers of pilots. Eleanor Roosevelt, because of her interest in women's roles and in human rights in general, Eleanor Roosevelt requests that women be included in this. And so the civilian pilot training program in 1939 said that for every 10 men, 1 woman can also get training as a pilot. And this program made possible the large numbers of women who are going to later apply for the WASP program. And so both of these women in this moment are in this world of the civilian pilot training program, we just want you to be thinking about women pilots. They were told kind of just thank you for your time, and we moved along. What happens then later, because both of these women, by the way, I think should be household names, like Amelia Earhart is a household name, because they had thousands of flying hours. Both of these women, especially Jackie Cochran, set so many records, flight and aviation records during their lifetime. Jackie Cochran was the first woman to break the sound barrier because of her relationship with other pilots. But both of these women approach General Arnold again a couple times after the U.S. Joins World War II. In 1942, in the spring, General Arnold at this time decides that maybe it would be a good idea to see what use women could be to replace men so that they could be sent overseas for combat. And so what he does is he gives them each a women's pilot program. Those programs eventually merge to become the WASP. And so these women are taking leadership roles. The assumption is that they will be given rank once they are militarized, but that does not happen, and so instead they're just given civilian titles. But both these women are passionate about this era. They're also friends with Amelia Earhart, just to kind of give you an idea of their generation. Women did serve officially in the military prior to World War II. And so I just wanted to give recognition to them and kind of give you some context. So women did serve in the U.S. military, starting with the American Revolution, with women who cross-dressed and fought in combat and things like that. But when you think about more recent conflicts with World War I, women served as nurses for the Army and Navy. They also were in the Signal Corps. These women who are pictured here with, several others are given official military status in the 1970s, and so they become the first ones on the record to be officially in the military. During World War II, you had women's units. Like I said, every one of these received military status from Congress because the way that it worked at the time was Congress needed to pass legislation to give you military status. So I put the acronym and then what the acronym stood for each of these. So with the WACs, Women's Army Corps, the WAVES, which they're very much going for a pun here, right? For women in the Navy, which I think is interesting. And that's kind of setting me up to describe the Women Marines, which you see notably do not have an acronym. And that is because General Thomas Holcomb said, they're Marines, they don't need a nickname. And so I think that sums up the culture that the Marines, has established for themselves, but also why they don't have an acronym. If you think about like the numbers of women, the Women Air Force Service Pilots are also the smallest women's unit. They're going to have 1,102 in total that graduate from training and are part of the program. Whereas if you think about the WACs, I can show you numbers later, we're talking hundreds of thousands of women. So the WASP are very much the smaller unit, but that's because you had to have flying hours as a pilot before you came into the program. And so that just meant that, if you're a woman who's interested in flying, you can't just join the WASP. You have to have your pilot's license and a certain number of flying hours. Just to situate like who were the WASP, like who was able to like be a part of this program, it is women who at the time, because of the way World War II worked with these women's units, and if you think about the Jim Crow military and segregation, there were black units, right, and then there was everyone else. So for the WASP, there were no black women who were allowed to join. We have several black women pilots in the era who were famous in their time period, who wrote into Jackie Cochran and asked to be in this program, but Jackie wrote them back and said, we're too concerned about the image of this program and its like acceptance socially among the American public, and so at this time we're afraid to accept you. The Women Marines was the same way, but all of the other women's units eventually had a segregated black women's unit. I wanted to just mention, though, that there were 2 women who were Chinese American who served in the WASP. One of them, Hazel Ying Lee, lost her life during the war. There are also 2 Native American women who were part of these tribes that you see listed here. So, of the women who joined this program, so there are 25,000 women who apply for the program. There were 1,830 who were then accepted for training, and then of those we have 1,102. So of the women, if you think about like numbers, the Army Air Force described this program at first as an experiment. General Arnold actually said in one of his like final speeches for the WASP in 1944, he said, I didn't know whether the slip of a young girl could handle the controls of a B-29, because he thought that women didn't have the upper body strength to handle, larger military aircraft like bombers during World War II. And so because it's described as an experiment at first, that meant that they kept tabs and statistics on everything about these women. They wanted to see, is the women's graduation rate from training the same as men? And the answer is yes, it was. Some classes of the WASP actually had a very slightly higher graduation rate than the men. They also looked at their test scores. They combined everything, all the data about them. Male pilots received combat training, but the WASP did not. So everything else was the same minus combat training. So that's why they were able to compare, test scores and everything else for these women. The training that they received was in Texas. So the first classes were trained at Houston. The rest of the classes were all trained at Sweetwater, Texas. So Sweetwater is in the West Texas Panhandle, so it is flat and dry. I went to school out there, so I can tell you about the dust storms and the way that the sand gets in your teeth and things like that. So when they're experiencing training, they're kind of bonding over these moments that they experience in West Texas. But also West Texas is a great place for training because the weather is relatively moderate. The base is used just for women pilot trainees. So actually what's unique about it is that all phases of pilot training occurred at this one base for women. And while there were male instructors, there were not other men at the base. So there were no male pilot trainees at Sweetwater, Texas. It was just for the WASP. So when they're training, the WASP are learning the same things as men in ground school, again, except for the combat maneuvers, etc. And so they learn navigation, Morse code, how to take apart engines, all the basic things that you need. And then they also then have flight school with their flying hours. Because of the base being, relegated only to women, I use this picture to show you that it's, very windy in West Texas. Most of the women who took pictures at base took a picture by this sign. I love the different iterations of it, which I didn't have time to, we don't have time to go through all the iterations of this photo, but this is what the sign looks like. And then there were some that would cover up the W and the O of women. So it would, read men trainees as kind of like a joke. They called the base Cochran's Convent, named after Jackie Cochran, because there were no men. But also what's interesting about this is that when the base first opens, and it's very, common knowledge that this is where women are going to be training for the first time, etc. The base gets a lot of emergency landings from male pilots who say, "Oh, I've really got to land." And so what Cochran does is, in consultation with Arnold, says, "Okay, we're done. There's no more emergency landings at Sweetwater. This, you don't need to come look at the women." So the women actually, because they were really concerned about stereotypes that the WACs had experienced in the Army. So when women are entering the military in this way during World War II for the first time, it is unique from previous wars because they are going through basic training. They're being issued military uniforms that are both skirts but also pant versions of the uniform, which, if you keep in mind, for this era was controversial for the time for women to wear pants in public. And so the WACs got a lot of really intense media slur campaigns against them, where instead of saying, "Oh, we have women, serving in the Army, look at these female soldiers," instead what's said about them is, "What are these women really doing overseas?" And so they say that these women are servicing men, right? That's what, and the Army's like, "Please, make it stop," right? And so they're constantly promoting, these are professional women, this is what their jobs are, etc. And most of what women in the other branches are doing, Army, Marines, Coast Guard, is they're doing things that are considered to be traditional for women. So yes, they have nurse corps, so there's nursing, but also a lot of things related to communications, doing admin work, things like that. And so even though the women aren't even doing things that would be considered controversial jobs to the American public, there are still these media campaign slurs about them. There are also rumors that you entered the WACs and you wore, the dress pant uniform version of the uniform, that these women are becoming lesbians, was the argument. And so it's like, don't send your daughters or... And so there's these fears about women's sexuality, but also fears about women accepting new roles and serving in the military in this way, and women being stationed overseas, even though they're not stationed in combat. There's still all these fears and concerns. So for the WASP in particular, they are not going to be stationed overseas. There's such a small number of them, and the Army Corps is concerned about a woman's death overseas, and especially because the WASP are not performing anything considered to be traditional for women because they're literally flying military planes. The WASP program, the decision is made, we're gonna not station them overseas. There are women who fly a couple missions to Canada and also to Cuba. So there are, a few missions where you're kind of overseas in that respect, but otherwise not like, the WACs who are stationed in North Africa, et cetera, right? So these women are, having these jobs. Because of this, Cochrane, the reason why it's also called Cochran's Convent is because Cochrane decides, we really need to make sure that these women aren't doing anything that's seen as quote unquote sexually promiscuous. So they had rules and regulations about women dating. So dating an instructor was forbidden. If you were in your dress uniform in public, you were not supposed to be going on a date. There were very specific rules about what you could and could not do because they were worried about the media saying negative things about women pilots. Some women, while there's not an intense media campaign about that in particular, there are some some women who, when they're performing work like ferrying planes across the U.S., had members of the American public who were confused about what they were doing because the program was kept under wraps from the media to such an extent. All right, so assignments. They were stationed at over 120 bases across the continental United States. They performed work, the majority of them were ferrying aircraft. So we have members of the audience today whose family members were Rosie the Riveters. So Rosie the Riveters would build planes in factories. The WASP would fly these planes to different bases. They would also fly planes to the coasts of the US so they could be taken overseas. That was one of their predominant jobs. Ferrying was interesting because, essentially what happens by the time this program ends in 1944 is women have flown every type of aircraft available to the U.S. Army Air Force during the war. So any new technology that's coming out, women are working as test pilots alongside with men. When they're ferrying aircraft, you have to learn very quickly how to fly different types of aircraft because you're not always sure what your next assignment's going to be. And while you're given training for that, there's sometimes situations where you don't have as much training as you would have hoped for that particular aircraft. The other thing that the WASP did that put themselves in harm's way directly in terms of live ammunition was they towed targets during the war. So at the top left, you see a publicity photo that was taken by a journalist from what you can see like the wing of the plane that they're in. The WASP would tow targets, so they were canvas, basically like canvas tarps that were hooked by cables to the back of the plane. And male cadets on the ground would practice shooting anti-aircraft artillery, which you see on the bottom right. There would be different colors within the casings so that it would leave this faint trace of color if you hit the target. So you would know, oh, from this gun, yellow, you did really great today. Blue, there are some things we need to work on, right? Because you didn't hit the target or whatever. They also had men practice combat maneuvers in the air while the women flew this same repeated pattern back and forth so that men could practice shooting at the target, sort of simulating combat in a different way, right? Not as directly because it's slower, but you get the sense of it. And so when women took these jobs, men had also been towing targets on the home front during World War II. There are a lot of Army Air Force pilots who are stationed in the home front who don't go overseas, right? Because they're instructors on different bases. They're towing targets. They're also ferrying planes because you just need so many people to do these jobs. So what happens when the WASP tow targets is that there are male pilots who complain to General Arnold and say that they no longer want to do these work that the men describe as chores. So they literally use the word chores or different iterations. One of them calls it dishwashing, etc. And I find this fascinating because live ammunition is being shot at targets, right? And so nothing about this gives you the feel of chores. I mean, I guess depending on what chores you're performing. But they're, performing this work that's incredibly dangerous, but it is, minimized. Their professionalism is minimized because you're using words like chores. They also said women would be better suited to do this. They told Arnold because they said, they're flying a pattern back and forth in the air. So it's like a repetitive pattern. And they say that women are better suited to tedious, repetitive tasks, were the phrases that were used. So just to give an idea of, again, this work that's dangerous that they were doing before women were assigned it, and then afterwards the language is shifting. No, I want to give this disclaimer now because I've explained that there are some women who died during the war. No women died from live ammunition, but there are women who died towing targets because the planes that you're flying, you don't want to fly new aircraft, right? So you're flying old, repaired planes in some way. Mechanics on bases at, Camp Davis in North Carolina, for example, talk about how this is problematic for them because they're trying to keep up with repairs, but they only have so much time and so many resources to do things. And so there are women, for example, who die because they need to make an emergency landing. They realize that they need to bail out of their aircraft, but then their hatch won't open, and so they're trapped inside when the plane crashes. So there are a total, during the war, there are 38 women who die at some point from this work because, again, like World War II aviation is dangerous, right? No matter what it is that you're doing. The last assignment I wanted to describe, I wanted to use Colonel Paul Tibbets because I think a lot of people might recognize his name or face at the very least. Colonel Paul Tibbets was, many things obviously during his career, but in particular, he was a B-29 pilot. And so when the B-29 was first developed, it had a problem with regards to it would develop engine fires. They eventually worked this out, but there were some male test pilots who died because of these engine fires, and so it was dubbed a widowmaker. And so men didn't want to be assigned the B-29. And so what happens is General Arnold asked Colonel Paul Tibbets, like, hey, do you have any ideas how we could possibly get get men interested in flying the B-29, because we have a real morale problem like on our hands. And so Paul Tibbets comes up with the idea to train WASP to fly the plane, and he says, I'm sure if you have a woman fly it and then land it for the men, that men will change their minds about it. And sure enough, these are the first two women to do it, Dora Dorothy Strother and Dorothea Johnson Mormon, who both are trained by Tibbets to fly the B-29. Literally all they do is, basically a flying demonstration, land on a base, get out of the plane, and then as Tibbets describes it, all of a sudden morale is better. So men would say like, oh, it must be fine. And what's interesting about this to me is it taps into stereotypes that happened, in the decades before World War II about driving and female drivers, and how advertisements would, say, this car is so easy, even a woman can drive it. And so all those like stereotypes are what they're kind of, Paul Tibbets is tapping into, right, to get men to then fly the B-29. So V. Thurn Cowden, one of these WASP, said about flying. She said, the P-51, so this pursuit aircraft, was the love of my life. It was so well engineered that when you were flying and once you had it trimmed, if you leaned forward, it would go up. Oh, sorry, I just said it wrong. If you, that once you had it trimmed, if you leaned forward, it would go forward. If you leaned back, it would go up. You could turn it, you didn't have to touch it. I love this quote because she's explaining, again, like the beauty of this aircraft, like what she loves about flying it specifically, because all the women in their letters home or in their oral history interviews decades after the war, when they talk about their favorite aircraft during World War II, they're always talking about how it's different from the lighter civilian aircraft that they had access to. And even after the war, it's a long time, it's the 70s before commercial aviation opens up to women pilots. So even these WASP who later, are going to be out of jobs are going to ask commercial airlines are going to say, no, thank you, but you can be a flight attendant if you want. And so they talk about how much different it is to fly, faster or bigger, like the bombers, right? And how these heavy aircraft are just a different experience and how much they loved it. They can fly at different altitudes, they can fly faster, etc. Just thinking about the ways that they loved this experience, but also for some of them, they talk about how they literally, their field at Sweetwater was called Avenger Field because they said they were avenging men's deaths overseas. Some women literally enlisted. One enlisted because her husband died overseas and she decided she wanted to avenge his death by serving the way he had in becoming a pilot, and then eventually she was a WASP. There were others who served because their brothers, uncles, fathers died in combat and they wanted to serve in that way and do what they could. And so these women are participating in this world that we think of, but specifically to aviation. The program was organized as military because the assumption was that just like for the WACs and the SPARs and the WAVES and the women Marines, that these women would also get military status before Congress. And so they were issued military uniforms, they took oaths, they were issued dog tags. Everything in terms of their organization was the same. They did have those additional rules about dating. Otherwise, though, they didn't operate like typical civilians. So when you were stationed at a base, if you were a civilian male pilot who was ferrying planes, which was a thing that happened, you could come and go as you wanted to. You didn't actually have to take leave officially or get your leave approved. You didn't have to face the same Army bureaucracy, etc. And so for the WASP, though, they couldn't do that. They operated as though they were military. They were treated as though they were military the entire time, because the assumption was one day you will. So the picture on the right is from one of the WASP graduation ceremonies, again in the flat world of West Texas. On the left, I include this picture because this is one of the many women that I interviewed about their wartime service. This is WASP Marty Weil. I took her picture at her home in Indiana. And when I interviewed Marty that day, towards the end of the interview, she got really excited and was like, "Do you want to see my uniform?" And I was like, "Of course." And so she went into her closet. She's like, "It doesn't fit me anymore, but I want to show you." So she held it up for me, and I asked if I could use her picture. So this was not without her consent. But she said, she was just so proud of her military service, which I thought was really, again, interesting and unique for these women in particular. And so she was proud of her service and her uniform and things like that. So again, Congress, I'm going to talk about why they don't pass the bill, but because they don't, the 38 women who died during the war, which at the top left, this is a picture of a WASP newsletter. So Jane Chamberlain was one of the WASP trainees who died in an accident with her instructor, who's listed up here, Henry Aubrey. So they were in an accident on the base at Sweetwater, and they both died in this accident. And so what the WASP did was very similar practice to men, where a lot of men's units during World War II, especially at particular bases, they would have newsletters for themselves. So it was just created by them, for them. There's not like pay involved, but there's also not censorship involved. And so the women would publish memoriams for the instructors and the WASP who died. They also published in memoriams for men who died overseas as well, like specific men, but sometimes they would just list a particular battle, a particular operation, and would say, we want to remember these men who died like in service to our country. And so they would incorporate that. Just like male pilots, they also had songs that they would sing. Other men's units did this too during the war. So they had songs that they would sing, that they would take popular songs, like children's songs, and then rewrite the lyrics, and then they would sing them. So men often did this during training. The WASP did the same. From the picture on the bottom right, this is one of the memorial services that they have every year in Sweetwater, Texas, when the WASP meet for reunions, which at this point now, sadly, there are not WASP who are able to make it out to Sweetwater for their reunions. But at the time, when they were able to, they would meet and have a memorial service each year for the 38 who died during the war and who very much were on their minds in the decades after World War II. So if you even think of pop culture, things like Top Gun, right? When pilots lose each other, like in accidents or, whatever the case might be, it's a traumatic thing that you have to try to work through. And so women would try to do this through their memoriams. Sometimes they would also, there were some WASP who during a time of leave would go into Mexico because the border was open at the time. And they bought a bottle of tequila that they said they were going to drink when they graduated. And so they also bought some sombreros, they said. So, they come back, they end up graduating training, but one of the women in their class, she died, who was on this trip with them. And so when her parents came to the graduation, the WASP said, we hid the tequila from them because we weren't sure how they'd feel about that, but we gave them the other souvenirs. And then later that night after graduation, we each took a shot in her memory. So they did things just, like men did, right, to kind of grieve the loss. Some women had superstitions, just like male pilots did. They would do certain things or bring certain things with them before they got in the aircraft in the hopes that that would keep them safe. So they would have certain rituals. If you've seen Masters of the Air, you've seen this practiced, right? And so it was very much the same for these women as well. There was one woman in particular who I interviewed, Shootsy Reynolds, who is from Connellsville, Pennsylvania. And she said, for example, that she saw the results of one aircraft accident one time and then decided never again was she going to look at an accident site because she said it was too demoralizing, and she said it was harder to get in the aircraft after that, and so she didn't want to look at accident sites anymore. All right, so 1944. In 1944, the WASP bill is the last one of the women's units to go before Congress. So when it goes before Congress, Congress is going to debate it just like they did the women in the Army, Marines, etc. Top Air Force officials like General Arnold, but also Secretary of War Henry Stimson and other government officials testified before Congress and said, hey, we've spent a lot of taxpayer money on this. These women are successful. They've proved a successful experiment. They're able to fly. We've trained them just like you have with other women's units. Please give them military status. Kind of assuming that it was going to be a straightforward process like it was with the others. 1944, I have this sort of like timeline kind of thing up here for you. 1944 was a unique moment because that civilian pilot training program that I mentioned, it shut down in 1944 as this bill was going before Congress. So the program had been renamed the CAA-WTS, which you can see here, the Civil Aeronautics Administration War Training Service. That program had a lot of male instructors in it who had a draft deferment. They were not, subject to the draft because of their home front service as instructors. What these men did whenever the program shuts down and the bill goes before Congress is they actually testified before Congress and tapped into some of these like stereotypical fears that people had during World War II and said, these women, these WASP, are taking jobs from as male flight instructors. We should be flying, B-29s, B-51s for the Army Air Force. It shouldn't be women. Arnold and Stimson, again, testify. Arnold in particular is okay, please don't listen to these men because they're actually not qualified because of height, age, eyesight, etc. He's like, that's actually how they ended up being instructors in this program. So they're not actually eligible even to be pilots for the Army Air Force. So this, kind of ignore what they're saying, basically. Congress agrees to disagree, and many of the representatives listen to these voices and are like, oh, men are taking women's jobs, or women are taking men's jobs. We have to think about this. So the political cartoon on the right represents this. So this is a male instructor, represented here, right, who sold his war training service pilot instructor uniform to this shop and has purchased women's clothing, right? He's wearing a skirt, etc. And he's off to get a job in the Army Air Force, as it says at the top. So there's this media campaign that comes out against the WASP where many media publications say very similar things to this cartoon. They say, again, lots of headlines about women taking men's jobs. They also had other publications that I wanted to just kind of direct your attention to in terms of themes for what they're showing in this era. So one of the other things was there was a journalist in particular who kept calling the WASP a lipstick squadron and was trying to undermine their professionalism through his use of this phrase. He did not talk about the WASP losing their lives or the dangerous target towing or the things that they were doing professionally. Instead, what he just emphasized was these women have done a nice service and everything, but now we need to let men take their place, okay? So I use this Life magazine article because this is actually before the WASP bill. This is in July 1943. This is one of the WASP who's on the cover. I think, so what I say way more extensively in my book that I can only say in brief here is that the media portrayal of the WASP, because so many things were censored in terms of what they could or could not publish about these women because of, the Cochrane and Arnold's fears about media campaigns and slurs, they wanted to make sure that the women were not doing anything that was too controversial in media publications. So this Life magazine article, which it's open copyright, you can look at it for free online, the entire issue. There are several photographs of the WASP, but I picked two that kind of represent what happens in this article. So when you look at the pictures of the article, because we all know not everybody reads the articles, right? The pictures show the WASP almost entirely at leisure. So they're sitting, drinking a Coca-Cola, they're writing a letter home, they're sunbathing, right? With the military trucks and planes in the background, right? This was a very small blip, there were very small moments of leisure during training, right? Same with men. but this is what Life magazine chose to publish predominantly, was Women at Leisure. The woman on the cover, what I found really fascinating was their records still exist, from the journalist in terms of why they selected this WASP, Shirley Slade, to be on the front. They said that they picked her because she was the most beautiful woman on base, according to these journalists, subjective, I realize, but who they thought was the most beautiful. And they said that they told her to put her hair in these braids and to put these bows in her hair. So she was basically specifically styled and selected because of her appearance. And so the intention behind this, article, while yes, it was telling the American public, this is, wide subscription numbers across the US, it's telling them about the WASP, it's also giving them this kind of lighthearted, not professional image of them at the same time. Because when you talk to the WASP, and also when you read their records and look at their pictures, there are no WASP walking around with, first of all, bows in their hair. Second of all, their hair down like this, right? You keep your hair up in like a turban or netting because of you're flying planes. Your hair is not blowing everywhere, right? And so there's all these very specific things that they're doing with the media coverage. There was also this really terrible 1944 Hollywood movie that came out that was called Ladies Courageous, that portrayed women that they called WASP, who were flirting with men and crashing government planes. So the whole movie was about this major love triangle and this woman who kept flirting with everybody and crashing her plane. And there's no record of that happening. You can look at all the accident reports. It's not a thing. And so anyway, it is what it is, but that tells you why when Congress is debating it, Congress mentions that movie, which I think is fascinating because it kind of is like Congress now, right? Where it's just like everyday people ingesting media and then talking about it on the floor of Congress, right? So they talk about this Hollywood movie and like, oh, but didn't you see the movie about them? And like all this other stuff. Okay. So Congress votes no, we're not going to give them military status. And so there's WASP. She's not related to the famous Disney family, but her last name is Disney. So this WASP in particular says this about not getting military status. So she said, I most certainly did expect to be militarized, and I was most disappointed when we were disbanded. I did not join, train, and serve to become anything other than a pilot, and I wanted the opportunity to continue to serve in an airborne capacity. And I love the last part because she said, I never flew an airplane that asked if I were a Mr. or a Mrs. or a Ms. Because there are women pilots today who've used very similar quotes when asked about their capabilities, who say, I've never gotten in a plane that cared who I was, like as an individual, right? The plane wanted me to handle it, like, right? And so these women are disappointed and devastated. Arnold announces, we didn't get military status. So December 20th, 1944, this year is the 80th anniversary of that, right? It's shut down. And so these women are left without military service, but also without, aviation jobs after the war. It's very difficult to find jobs to be in aviation or involved in aviation. So what they do is very similar to what other units do post any war or conflict, is they hold reunions. So I picked 4 photos from 4 different reunions to kind of show you them over time. The WASP would meet for yearly reunions at a national level, but also sometimes a local level. And they would reminisce about the war, right? In some of the early years, starting like 1948, they actually have discussions amongst themselves that they keep notes of meeting minutes, right, of what they discuss. And in these minutes, they say, like, we really want to honor the 38 somehow who died because we just think it's such a tragedy that they didn't get to have their recognition. Some of the WASP are also disappointed at the end of the war because unlike women in the Navy, Marines, etc., they don't have access to the GI Bill, right? They don't have access to health benefits. They had the weirdest civilian insurance during the war. There were women who were trying, you know how you fight with insurance? Women were trying, there was one woman who flew a cargo plane full of men who had come back from the hump, specifically in the China-Burma India theater. These men, one of them had some sort of fungal ear infection that he picked up in the jungle. One of the women got that ear infection and had to fight with her insurance company because what kind of a situation is that, right? Where you're getting, it like didn't make sense to them and they couldn't compute it. So women also talk about these things too, right? So eventually they decide, okay, we need to have a serious, concerted, organized effort to try to get military status. So two men who help them with their political connections are Senator Barry Goldwater, who you see seated here, and on the right is Colonel Bruce Arnold, who was General Hap Arnold's son. So he, in particular, knew very well about his father's wishes for this to be militarized and was like, yeah, this is an easy yes for me to help you try to get this. Barry Goldwater is really interesting because in the 1970s, he did not want women to enter the service academies, and he also didn't want women to enter combat aviation. But he thought that, so he's, voting in these specific ways. At the same time, he says, oh, the WASP obviously should get military status, and any man who votes against this is a quote-unquote male chauvinist, using the language of women's liberation at the time, and said, this is an obvious yes. Barry Goldwater served alongside the WASP. He was stationed with some of them at Newcastle Army Air Force Base in Delaware, and so he knew firsthand that they were who they were, right? And so he's like, I don't have any question in my mind that they were military, so obviously I'm going to help them get this. So these men used their political connections to help the WASP. It was not an easy battle, actually. So when you read the congressional records, in the 1970s, Congress is debating whether or not these women deserve military status. So there are some men who testify before Congress who say, I don't think these women should get military status because a veteran is male. And he even specifically said a veteran is a combat male, which is, as we know, not the majority, right? And so he's like, this is who a veteran is. Then you have the national headquarters of the American Legion, the national headquarters of the VFW, who come before Congress and say, they're literally like reading out of a Webster's dictionary the definition of a term veteran, which doesn't say men or women in it, by the way. It just says service to your country. But they say, based on our definitions and our understanding of this, the WASP were not veterans. They weren't military. And if you give them this term, it will forever denigrate the term. And so they put a lot of heavy weight into this. If you're in a VFW or American Legion, please don't be offended, because local chapters actually of these two organizations supported the WASP. So I found numerous local chapters that disagreed with the national headquarters decision. So it was an interesting struggle. The Combat Pilots Association, the Air Force Association, all these other ones related to pilots and combat specifically, all testified before Congress that the WASP should be militarized. And so there was this battle and debate. In the end, the WASP got veteran status in 1977. When it's being debated in Congress, I put 1973 on here because women are admitted to pilot training for the Navy, right? And then eventually, short after, the Army and the Air Force. The Marines waits until the 90s, but for the Coast Guard and Army, Navy, etc., they are giving women military status or pilot status. And so when women are flying planes in 1973, a lot of media publications headlines say, this is the first time women are flying military planes. So the WASP are horrified because they're like, well, first of all, we're fighting in Congress right now to try to get military status, but also we did fly military planes, and so hello, we still exist, right? In 2010, they received a Congressional Gold Medal, which this is a picture of the medal and from that ceremony. And so they do get this other recognition later. But there was one final thing that I wanted to tell you about in terms of the WASP having to struggle or fight for their veteran status. So I kind of provocatively put on here who is a veteran surrounding this story of Elaine Danforth Harmon, who is one of the WASP. So what happens is the WASP get veteran status in 1977. When they go to their to the VA to try to get benefits after they get their DD-214s, etc., some of the WASP are turned away because of misunderstandings of paperwork. And so there's a bunch of different things that I talk about in my book that have to happen to get them rights. But the next big thing that happens is in 2015 when WASP Elaine Danforth Harmon passes away. So I had actually interviewed her 3 years before this, and when I interviewed her, she had said that she was really proud of her military service. She came from a military family, like men in her family had all served, her husband served, and she was really excited to be interned at Arlington National Cemetery because, in 1977, that eventually, opens up that right for you. And so she's like, I'm really proud of my service. When I pass away, I'm going to be interned there, and I'm really proud of it. So in 2015, I read this news article in the newspaper about how Elaine's family had applied for her application to Arlington National Cemetery and had been denied. Because a couple months before she passed away, the Secretary of the Army had issued a memo saying, we're running out of room at Arlington, so we need to limit who's going to be interned there. And of the people we want to limit, the WASP are no longer going to be interned here. And her family obviously did not know about this, right? So her granddaughter, who I had met her granddaughter and her daughter through like reunions, but also because I interviewed their grandma mom, right? They were like, we at first thought, because her granddaughter, Erin Miller, who wrote a book about this experience, said, I'm, not sure what to do here as an attorney. I think we're just maybe going to file a lawsuit or something. We haven't decided. But then what she realizes is if we do that, that means any other WASP who die won't get to be interned there. So what we want to do is we actually realize we need legislation. So there was Martha McSally, a combat pilot, like veteran herself, right? She led this before Congress. Long story short, miraculously, unanimously passes Congress. So I say miraculously because it was unanimous. So it passes Congress unanimously. The WASP can now be interned at Arlington National Cemetery. And so this is a picture of her daughter receiving her flag in 2016. So this is her service. So with that, I just want to conclude and say that, women in history have tried to get their veteran status recognized, right? Because even today's female veterans say sometimes when they go to the VA, they're told, oh, well, where's your husband's service? And it's like, no, it's my service, right? And so how this relates to these larger issues of women fitting into these military spaces, but also being seen and perceived as veterans in the American public. So I am leaving you with a picture from a WASP reunion that I attended where they're singing one of their songs, which is why I captured it from the side here. But I would love to answer any questions that you have about the WASP program, about women pilots, any of the things.
Thank you very much, Dr. Myers. We do have a mobile microphone now for questions, so if anybody has questions, please do feel free to ask.
Thank you. I don't know if I need a mic. Right, so my understanding, or this question's about Hap Arnold. My understanding was that he was very adamant about defending the reputation of women in the service, specifically when it came to the slander campaign, having zero tolerance towards it, whereas other branches not so much. I'm curious if you could speak more about his attitude towards women in the service.
Yeah, Arnold was really interesting because, like I'd said at first, he was like, I didn't know if women would be able to handle military aircraft. But as soon as the WASP proved successful, literally as soon as those first trainees prove that they're successful, he is an all-out advocate for women in the Army Air Force and is fully convinced that they're going to be integrated as a part of it. There's not a question in his mind. He is also friends with Jackie Cochran, who's director of this program. I think that friendship and his respect in the pilot community, right, among men and women, also helps make that possible. But yes, he actively speaks out numerous times in his busy World War II schedule, right, to say, like, we want these women to get military status. Will you please stop listening to rumors circulating in the media? He really tries to push, like, the taxpayer issue. He tries to use his position as, in an authoritarian governmental position, right, to be like, hey, as my role in the military, you should take me seriously, and my voice should have weight and meaning to it, that these women are just as equipped, but also we want them. And yet, crazily to me, he's ignored. Yeah.
In the back. I'm gonna go back here, sir, and then up front.
How many veterans did you interview for your book, and did they have any common traits that stood out to you, being, veterans?
Yeah, I love that question. So I actually had more interviews that I read than I took. So by the time I was interviewing them, they were in their mid to late 90s. So I was able to interview 38 of them, which is not a lot, but was significant to me at the time. WASP Marty Weil was actually my very first one. I met her grandson on an airplane, and she thought that was the coolest story ever. But there are hundreds of interviews that have been done, in particular by Texas Women's University, but NASA also did a lot. So I read every interview I could possibly find anywhere, so I read hundreds of interviews. The common themes that I saw that really stuck out to me were this love of flight and aviation, like just how in pilot nerdy they were, right? But also just how military minded they were, like professionals. Like they were, all of them, because I kind of expected for World War II, maybe some of them were just in it because they really like to fly, right? But it seemed like for the most part, the majority of them were like, yes, I was in it to fly, but I also wanted a military career. Like I saw myself in this career capacity. And I found that really interesting. I also found it interesting because they all had origin stories of how they got involved with flight. And for a lot of them, they said, well, the expectation for me was to be a nurse or a doctor, or sorry, not a doctor, a nurse or a secretary. When I tried to major in biology, I was told, you're going to have a husband and kids someday. You shouldn't major in biology. And so a lot of them had very strong personalities, which is why I think they were able to live as long as they did, is because they were very stubborn, honestly, and were like, no, I don't want to do any of those things. It doesn't sound fun. I want to do this. And so they had to not just persevere with your military career, but to try to get those initial flying hours because it was expensive. There were lots of sacrifices you had to make. They were very driven in their sense of this is what I want to do.
Hi, I just want to say I was glad you brought up the thing about the B-29s and the Widowmakers, but I think it was actually the B-26 where they were most important because those were scary planes to fly. They had a high stall speed. You had to land them at a very high speed. And the Air Force cadets were just really reluctant to fly them until the women started bringing them to the bases. It was really cool.
Yeah, I almost included a picture of the with the demonstrations with the B-26 because of the headlines that were underneath it. But what I think is interesting about what you're saying as well is there was an additional slang term, whatever we want to say, phrase used for the B-26 because of what you're saying, and that was a flying prostitute because they said it had no support, and so there was this is they're taking this very seriously, and you're exactly right. So yeah.
Any additional questions?
Who ferried the planes over the Atlantic?
Yeah, so sometimes they were on aircraft carriers, but anytime it was going over the Atlantic or the Pacific, it was flown by men. So male pilots are flying it or they're going on aircraft carriers. Yeah. There was a chance for two WASP. This was kind of going back to your Arnold question. There were two WASP, Nancy Love and another pilot, Teresa James, who were going to get the opportunity to ferry a plane across the Atlantic to Britain because women were flying from all over the world in Britain for the British Air Transport Auxiliary. Women from African countries, from South American countries, literally all over the place were flying for Britain. And so it was seen as we'll just have them ferried across the Atlantic. They're not even going to be in combat. They're not even going to be ferrying it over the channel like these women are doing for the British Air Transport Auxiliary. And so there was a planned flight that was canceled at the very last minute because Arnold had gotten wind that the media was planning on publishing about this, and he was worried that there was going to be some sort of campaign smear against the WASP. It was just a fear. So sadly, they did not get to do that.
Did you come across any in your research, any opinion did President Eisenhower have any opinion on the WASP program and them being denied veteran status?
That's a good question. I have not. The thing that I ran across though, so Eisenhower post World War II was actually friends with Jackie Cochran, Cochran and her husband and Eisenhower, right, and Mamie. But I haven't found anything from the wartime. I think it's because he was too busy with 5,000 other things, but it's a really great question. I've just never found anything, but her records are now housed at his library, so I think that also speaks to his respect for her as a professional, that her literal archival collection is housed there. Oh, there's one in the very back too. Yeah.
Did any of them eventually circle back to an interest with aviation and, get back into anything with that?
Yeah, some of them did. So some of them were able to fly cargo planes for private companies. No commercial aviation, no large corporations, but there were some private companies. So there was a woman in particular who made some cargo plane runs to South America for a decade and did that. A lot of women were flight instructors of just small civilian aircraft at their local planes. Some WASP were able to, in the 50s and 60s, some of them in the years before they had kids would come together and buy a plane together and then share it among their friends. But a lot of them, it was just for fun, or they do an air show sometimes. It wasn't a full-time career, something that they could make into a career. I will say for Jackie Cochran though, the other reason why someone should make a movie about her someday is because she actually invested her own money into training women for NASA for astronaut training in the 60s. And so she paid basically with the money that she had from herself, from her company that she was a millionaire from, and she also had a billionaire husband. And so she used all these monies basically to pay for this. Those women were not WASP, but they'd been inspired by the WASP. So it's kind of like a connection in that way.
I assume if you had found proof that you would have put it in the book, but do you think that Arnold being so cautious about public perception had anything to do with the WASPs not being given veteran status?
Yeah, so I argue that I don't have one reason why the bill didn't pass through Congress, but I do argue that I think that played a role unintentionally because it was so censored, there were just so few things they could show the WASP doing, and I think that had the unintended consequence of shaping public perception.
As a matter of curiosity, what ignited your personal interest in this topic?
Yeah, so Dr. John McManus, who spoke before me in the tent, was a professor at the university that I went to for undergrad. It's now called the Missouri University of Science and Technology. And when I was at that university, we were doing a final, sort of the version of a senior's thesis project. And I was trying to decide what to do mine on because I was struggling to come up with topics. And I found this story of the WASP, and I was really outraged because I was like, why didn't they get military status? This story doesn't make sense to me, right? And so there was this website where you could email a WASP and they would respond back to you. And so my, 22-year-old self that doesn't know much about this at all was emailing these poor women, and they responded back to me and were like, oh, here's some thoughts that we have, whatever. And so that really got me hooked in it because I was like, oh, I get to talk to people who actually were a part of this history, which was exciting for me. And then I also was just really interested in women's history anyway. And so women pilots in particular for this time period, I just thought, so it sounded so fascinating because the only pilot at that point I knew was Amelia Earhart. And then I learned that there's women who accomplished a lot of other things like Jackie Cochran that we don't even know about. And so it kind of hooked me that way. Yeah.
Many years ago, I had the opportunity to meet a number of WASPs at the Reading Air Show, and one of them was Shootsy, who nice. I lived not far from her, and so I got to spend some time with Shootsy, and she was a jewelry maker.
Yeah.
So she made some rings, things that were wings, and I got a WASP hat pattern from one of them, so we were able to recreate the hat. What I was curious about is the types of, did they go into professions? These were ladies with chutzpah. That's the way I see them, They were daredevils. I never flew because I reenacted as a WASP, but I never flew, but I did get a motorcycle, so I sort of felt like one of them, in my own way. But they were ladies that pushed the envelope, literally and figuratively. But do you know of any other, did they go into professions because of the era that it was, or did they go back to, not being able to have jobs, go back to being like homemakers?
I want to take a moment for Shootsy, just because you mentioned her, because I interviewed her when she was towards the end of her life. It was literally a year before she passed away. I don't remember her exact age in this moment, but I could get it for you. When I interviewed her, I was expecting to be 2 hours because most World War II interviews that I do with veterans from that time period in their late 90s, is their capacity is about 2 hours, which fair because sometimes that's all my capacity is too, right? So I go and I get there, and she is like, I've had a lot of people interview me about the WASP, so I'm gonna need to know what you know. So she proceeds to interrogate me with like all these questions, and then I pass her test because she's like, okay, you know enough, you can interview me. And I interview her for 8 hours. I had to tell her to take breaks. I was like, I think we need a break. Like, I need a break. Can I get some water? Like, it was so long. And then at the end, it's like, it will probably make me cry, but she had made these replica wasp wings into rings, and she gave me one, which is like, so I love that you have a memento for her as well. It's really special. Yes, so the women in terms of, and also I love that it's so expensive to get your pilot's license too, that I have never learned tragically, because it's like, I can't afford that, that's fine. So the professions that they went into are just so diverse that it's hard to sum up in like a couple sentences, because there were women who pursued advanced degrees after World War II, which again is still pretty early for a lot of women, right? Getting your like master's or sometimes even your PhD in a field. There were also women who like Shootsy carved their own path and were like, I'm really interested in a lot of different things, and so they came up with like different career paths for themselves, or were involved with art and jewelry making, right? Or it kind of depended, but I would say that the basis of it is like resilience in trying to carve out a space for you. You've just had this early moment in your life, right, to make a big career pivot. So what am I going to do now, right? And so I think that it speaks to their resilience that so many of them were able to carve paths for themselves. I also think it speaks to just, human life in general. Lots of times we're told, like, you must know what you want to do when you're 18 years old. And then you must have achieved all your career accomplishments by the time you're 40 or 45. And it's like some people don't even get their careers till they're 55. And so it's like, I think that their story kind of speaks to that, in the sense that they were willing and ready to like pivot and be resilient and find their own like path and what they wanted to do.
Fanny Flagg's book, are you familiar? Can you make any comments about that? How accurate is it, or?
Okay, so first I thought you were actually saying a different name. Is this isn't the memoir that was done by the last name Stagg?
About the all ladies, girls service station last reunion.
Oh, I haven't read that.
Oh, okay.
I'll have to look it up. I'm sorry. I have my card, so if you want to email me, I can tell you after I've read it. But yeah, I have not.
Were there any other questions for Dr. Myers? All right. Well, again, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Our next talk will be at 1 p.m.